Welcome. I trust you are ready for a new mystery to unfold.
The Widow Who Smiled Too Soon, a Hercule Poirot mystery. Hello, dear listeners, and welcome back to Cozy Mysteries. I'm Stephen, your host, and today I bring you a tale that begins not with tears, as one might expect, but with the most inappropriate of sounds following a funeral, laughter. Our story unfolds in the quaint village of Little Wickham, where the cobblestones have witnessed countless secrets, but none quite as perplexing as what transpired in the autumn of 1934. Chapter 1: The Laughter That Echoed Too Soon. The great detective found himself in Little Wickham quite by accident, having missed his intended train connection to London. The delay, which initially frustrated him greatly, would prove most fortuitous indeed. As he settled into his temporary lodgings at the Crown Inn, the proprietor, Mrs. Pemberton, could barely contain her excitement at having such a distinguished guest. "Oh, Monsieur Poirot," she whispered conspiratorially across the polished oak counter, "you've arrived at such a peculiar time. The whole village is talking about Mrs. Blackwood. That's the widow, you see. Her husband, Charles Blackwood, was buried just 2 days past, and already she's been seen about town, not weeping as one might expect, but actually laughing. Can you imagine such a thing?" The detective's famous grey cells immediately began their delicate work. He had observed over many years of studying human nature that grief manifested itself in countless ways, yet Mrs. Pemberton's scandalized tone suggested something beyond mere unconventional mourning. "This laughter," he inquired with characteristic precision, "it occurred in public, you say?" "Indeed it did, right outside Miller's tea shop, bold as brass. She was with a stranger too, a gentleman none of us had ever seen before. Tall, distinguished-looking fellow with a walking stick and the most peculiar accent. Foreign, I'd say, though I couldn't place it exactly." The detective's interest was thoroughly piqued. He requested directions to the Blackwood residence, a modest but well-maintained cottage on Elm Street, surrounded by a garden that showed signs of recent neglect. As he approached the front gate, he observed the windows, all properly draped in black crape, as tradition demanded. Yet something seemed amiss in this display of conventional mourning. A neighbour, Mrs. Hartwell, happened to be tending her own garden, and proved quite willing to share her observations. She was a woman of perhaps 60, with sharp eyes that missed very little of the neighbourhood's comings and goings. "You're asking about Eleanor Blackwood," she said, straightening her back with some effort. "Strange business, that. Poor Charles wasn't cold in his grave before she was entertaining that foreign gentleman. They sat in her parlour for hours, and I could hear voices, not the hushed tones of condolence, mind you, but actual conversation, even occasional laughter." The detective learned that Charles Blackwood had died suddenly of what the local physician had diagnosed as heart failure. The man had been in his 50s, reasonably healthy by all accounts, though he had complained recently of fatigue and occasional chest pains. His death, while unexpected, had not seemed particularly suspicious to anyone in the village. "Eleanor seemed devoted to him," Mrs. Hartwell continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "They'd been married 15 years, no children, kept mostly to themselves. Charles worked as a clerk at the bank in the next town over. Nothing exciting about their lives, really, until this stranger appeared." That evening, the detective took his dinner in the Crown Inn's cosy dining room, where the conversation inevitably turned to the village's most recent source of gossip. He learned that Eleanor Blackwood was originally from London, having met her late husband during a holiday in Brighton some 16 years prior. She had no close family in Little Wickham, which made her recent behaviour all the more conspicuous. The mysterious stranger had been staying at the inn for 3 nights prior to Charles Blackwood's funeral, claiming to be a traveling salesman of fine fabrics. He had kept largely to himself, taking his meals in his room and venturing out only for solitary walks through the village. His sudden friendship with the newly widowed Eleanor struck everyone as highly irregular. As the detective retired to his room that evening, he found himself contemplating the peculiar nature of human behavior in times of crisis. Experience had taught him that people often acted in ways that seemed incomprehensible to others, driven by emotions and motivations that remained hidden beneath the surface. Yet something about Mrs. Blackwood's public display of inappropriate cheer suggested a performance rather than genuine feeling. Tomorrow, he decided, he would call upon the widow herself. Perhaps a direct conversation would illuminate the mystery that had already begun to capture his imagination. Little did he know that by morning, the mysterious stranger would be found dead, and Eleanor Blackwood would find herself at the center of a most intriguing murder investigation. The autumn wind rattled the windows of the Crown Inn as our detective settled into sleep, his mind already working through the implications of what he had learned. In just a few hours, little Wickham would discover that some laughter comes at far too high a price. Chapter 2: A Stranger's Final Morning. The dawn brought with it a most disturbing discovery, dear listeners. The detective was awakened not by the gentle sounds of a countryside morning, but by the urgent rapping of knuckles against his door and the distressed voice of Mrs. Pemberton calling his name. "Monsieur Poirot, oh please, you must come quickly. Something terrible has happened." Upon opening his door, he found the innkeeper's wife in a state of considerable agitation, her usually immaculate appearance disheveled, her hands trembling as she wrung them together. "It's Mr. Thornfield, the gentleman staying in room 7, the foreign gentleman who's been here these past few days. I went to deliver his morning tea as usual, and when he didn't answer my knock, I used my master key. Oh, Monsieur Poirot, he's dead." The detective dressed quickly and followed Mrs. Pemberton to the second floor, where a small crowd had already gathered in the narrow hallway. The local constable, a young man named Davies who appeared overwhelmed by the situation, was attempting to maintain order while preventing curious onlookers from contaminating what was clearly a crime scene. Room 7 was modest but comfortable, typical of a country inn's accommodations. The deceased lay sprawled across the bed, fully clothed in the same attire he had worn the previous evening, a well-tailored suit of dark wool, now rumpled and twisted. His face bore the unmistakable pallor of death, but showed no obvious signs of violence. The detective's experienced eye immediately began cataloguing details. The window was slightly ajar, allowing the morning breeze to stir the curtains. A glass of water sat on the bedside table, half empty, alongside a leather-bound journal and a fountain pen. The man's walking stick, which Mrs. Pemberton had mentioned as being distinctive, leaned against the wall near the door. "Has anyone disturbed the scene?" the detective inquired of Constable Davies, who shook his head nervously. "Only Mrs. Pemberton when she discovered him, sir. She touched his wrist to check for a pulse, then immediately came to fetch me. I've sent word to the doctor and to Inspector Morrison in the county seat." Dr. Whitmore arrived within the hour, an elderly gentleman who served as the village physician. His preliminary examination revealed no obvious cause of death, no wounds, no signs of struggle, no immediate indication of how the stranger had met his end. "Could be natural causes," Dr. Whitmore mused, though his tone suggested uncertainty. "Heart failure perhaps, or a stroke. Though he seemed healthy enough when I saw him about the village. I'll need to conduct a more thorough examination, of course." While waiting for the inspector to arrive from the county seat, the detective took the opportunity to examine the deceased's belongings. The leather journal proved particularly interesting, filled with entries written in a neat, precise hand. The most recent entry, dated the previous evening, contained a curious passage. The widow proves more amenable than expected. Her grief appears genuine enough to casual observers, yet I detect calculation beneath the tears. Tomorrow's meeting will determine whether my suspicions are correct. The letter remains unposted. Perhaps wisdom suggests maintaining this discretion until I am certain of my ground. The detective's grey cells began their intricate work with renewed vigor. What letter, what meeting, and what suspicions had driven this stranger to such careful observations of Eleanor Blackwood? Further examination of the room revealed additional intrigues. Hidden beneath the mattress was a train ticket to London, dated for that very morning. The stranger had been planning to leave Little Wickham permanently. In the pocket of his overcoat hung carefully in the wardrobe, the detective discovered a small delicate item that would prove most significant: a woman's lace handkerchief finely made, and bearing the embroidered initial E. Mrs. Pemberton confirmed that the inn's housekeeping staff did not provide such items, and the handkerchief's delicate perfume suggested it was recently used. The implications were becoming increasingly clear. The stranger's relationship with Eleanor Blackwood had been more intimate than their public acquaintance suggested. Inspector Morrison arrived near midday, a competent-looking man in his 40s, who seemed pleased to have the famous detective's assistance with the case. Together they interviewed the inn staff and other guests, building a timeline of the stranger's final hours. The man had taken dinner in his room the previous evening, as was his custom. The meal had been delivered by young Mary, the kitchen maid, who reported that he seemed in good spirits and mentioned looking forward to concluding his business in the village. He had requested an early morning wake-up call, intending to catch the first train to London. "Did he receive any visitors last evening?" Inspector Morrison inquired. Mary shook her head, then paused. "Well, not exactly visitors, sir, but I did see him leave the inn around 8:30. Didn't return until quite late, past 11 I'd say. Mrs. Pemberton locks the front door at 10, but guests have keys, you see." This information proved most significant. Where had the stranger spent those crucial evening hours? The detective had a growing suspicion about the answer, but verification would require careful investigation. As the day progressed, word of the stranger's death spread throughout Little Wickham like wildfire. The detective noted with interest how news traveled in small communities, gathering embellishments and interpretations with each telling. Already speculation was rampant about the connection between the mysterious death and the recently widowed Eleanor Blackwood. By afternoon, Dr. Whitmore completed his preliminary examination and delivered his findings to Inspector Morrison. While he could not determine the exact cause of death without further tests, he noted unusual discoloration around the deceased's lips and fingernails that suggested possible poisoning. "I'll need to conduct more detailed analyses," the doctor explained, "but the symptoms are consistent with certain types of toxic exposure. If this was indeed murder, the killer possessed considerable knowledge of poisons and their effects." This revelation cast the entire situation in a new light. The detective found himself reconsidering every detail of what he had observed, particularly Eleanor Blackwood's behavior and her relationship with the deceased stranger. The stage was set for a most complex investigation, one that would require all of the detective's considerable skills to unravel. Chapter 3: The Widow's Perfect Alibi. The afternoon brought Inspector Morrison and our astute detective to the door of Elm Street Cottage, where Eleanor Blackwood awaited them with what appeared to be appropriate composure for a woman twice bereaved in the span of less than a week. Yet the detective's trained eye detected something theatrical in her demeanor, a quality that suggested careful preparation for this very encounter. "Mrs. Blackwood was a woman of perhaps 35, with auburn hair neatly arranged despite the circumstances, and dark eyes that seemed to assess her visitors with quick intelligence. She wore a black wool dress of good quality though not expensive, and her manner struck the perfect balance between grief-stricken widow and helpful citizen. "Gentlemen, please come in," she said, stepping aside to admit them into a parlor that spoke of modest comfort. "I understand there's been a terrible tragedy at the Crown Inn. Mrs. Hartwell mentioned that poor Mr. Thornfield has died. How shocking." The detective noted several interesting details about the room. Fresh flowers, inappropriate for a house in mourning, had been hastily removed, leaving rings of water on the side tables. The scent of cleaning supplies lingered in the air, suggesting recent and thorough housework. Most intriguing of all, a small writing desk in the corner showed signs of having been recently cleared, with only the faintest impression of writing visible on the leather blotter. Inspector Morrison conducted the initial questioning with professional competence, while the detective observed Mrs. Blackwood's responses with growing fascination. She claimed to have met Mr. Thornfield purely by chance 3 days prior, when they had quite literally collided on the village street. He dropping his walking stick, she dropping her market basket. "He was most apologetic and gallant," she explained, dabbing at her eyes with a plain cotton handkerchief, notably not the delicate lace item found in the deceased's room. "When he learned of my recent loss, he offered his condolences and suggested we take tea together. I found his company comforting during such a difficult time." Her alibi for the previous evening proved remarkably detailed and convenient. She had attended a meeting of the Ladies' Auxiliary at the church hall from 7 until nearly 10 o'clock, helping to organize the upcoming harvest festival. No fewer than 12 respectable ladies of the village could vouch for her presence and participation throughout the evening. "We were addressing invitations and discussing the arrangements for the bake sale," she explained. "Mrs. Whitmore, that's the doctor's wife, can confirm that I contributed 3 pounds of sugar from my own stores and volunteered to provide 2 apple pies for the event." The detective requested the names of all attendees, which Mrs. Blackwood provided without hesitation. Inspector Morrison dispatched a constable to verify her story immediately, and within 2 hours, confirmation arrived that Eleanor Blackwood had indeed been present at the church hall for the entire evening, actively participating in the auxiliary's work. Yet something about the widow's demeanor continued to trouble the detective. Her grief, while convincingly performed, seemed to turn on and off like a gas lamp. When speaking of her late husband Charles, appropriate sadness clouded her features. When discussing Mr. Thornfield, she appeared appropriately shocked by his death. But in the moments between these performances, her eyes held a sharpness that suggested careful calculation. "Mrs. Blackwood," the detective ventured with his characteristic politeness, "perhaps you could tell us about Mr. Thornfield's interests. Did he mention why he had chosen to visit Little Wickham?" "He said he was in the fabric trade," she replied promptly, "traveling to various towns to establish connections with local dressmakers and tailors. He mentioned that business had been challenging lately, the economic difficulties, you understand. He seemed quite worried about his financial situation." This information aligned with what the stranger had told Mrs. Pemberton, yet the detective sensed layers of meaning beneath the surface. The man's clothing and belongings suggested comfortable circumstances, not financial distress. His leather journal contained no references to business dealings or commercial concerns. During a brief moment when Inspector Morrison was examining the parlor's bookshelf, the detective noticed Mrs. Blackwood's gaze drift toward the writing desk in the corner. The glance lasted mere seconds, but it carried the weight of genuine concern, the first unguarded emotion he had observed from her. "I wonder," he said casually, "if Mr. Thornfield might have left any belongings here during his visits." Perhaps a book he was reading, or notes about his business. Mrs. Blackwood's composure faltered almost imperceptibly. No, nothing of that sort. We simply conversed over tea. He was very proper in his behavior, as befitted the circumstances. Yet when they prepared to leave, the detective managed to position himself near the writing desk. His acute observation revealed something that Mrs. Blackwood had overlooked in her careful preparations: a small fragment of paper caught in the desk's lower drawer, bearing part of an address written in a masculine hand: Arkwell Street, London 1. The implications were becoming increasingly intriguing. Mr. Thornfield had possessed Mrs. Blackwood's handkerchief, and had written what appeared to be a London address. His journal referenced an unposted letter and a scheduled meeting. Mrs. Blackwood had a perfect alibi for the time of his death, yet her behavior suggested intimate knowledge of the deceased beyond their claimed casual acquaintance. As they walked back toward the village centre, Inspector Morrison expressed satisfaction with the widow's cooperation and the strength of her alibi. The detective, however, found himself more puzzled than ever. Experience had taught him that perfect alibis often concealed imperfect truths. "Inspector," he said quietly, as they paused outside the church hall where Eleanor claimed to have spent the crucial evening, "I suggest we interview the ladies of the auxiliary with particular attention to specific times and movements. Perfect alibis often contain imperfect details when examined closely." Their subsequent interviews with the church ladies revealed interesting information. While all confirmed Eleanor's presence at the meeting, several mentioned that she had seemed distracted and had stepped outside multiple times for what she claimed were brief walks to clear her head. Mrs. Whitmore, the doctor's wife, provided the most specific details. Eleanor did contribute the sugar as she mentioned, and she was certainly present for most of the evening. However, I do recall her stepping out around 8:30, saying she needed some fresh air. She was gone for perhaps 20 or 30 minutes longer than a simple walk would require. This crucial detail shattered Eleanor's perfect alibi. 20 to 30 minutes would have been sufficient time to reach the Crown Inn, conduct business with Mr. Thornfield, and return to the church hall. The detective's suspicions were proving increasingly justified. That evening, as they dined at the Crown Inn, the detective shared his observations with Inspector Morrison. The case was developing into something far more complex than a simple death of natural causes. The stranger's journal, the handkerchief, the writing desk, and the widow's carefully maintained performance all pointed toward a deeper conspiracy. "Mark my words, Inspector," the detective said quietly, "we are not dealing with coincidence here." Mrs. Blackwood's laughter 2 days after her husband's funeral was not the behavior of a grieving widow overcome by relief. It was the behavior of a woman whose carefully laid plans were proceeding exactly as intended. The question now was not whether Eleanor Blackwood was involved in Mr. Thornfield's death, but how she had managed to commit murder while maintaining the appearance of being safely surrounded by witnesses 3 miles away. Chapter 4. Secrets in the Churchyard. Morning brought a persistent drizzle that seemed to match the somber mood settling over Little Wickham. The detective had spent a restless night pondering the contradictions of the case, and he rose early with a specific purpose in mind. Before breakfast, he made his way to St. Mary's Churchyard, where Charles Blackwood lay beneath a modest headstone marked only with his name and dates. The detective was not alone in his morning pilgrimage. He discovered Dr. Whitmore kneeling beside another grave some 20 yards away, tending to wilted flowers on what appeared to be his wife's resting place. The elderly physician looked up as footsteps approached on the gravel path. "Monsieur Poirot, you're abroad early this morning. I hope the circumstances haven't disrupted your sleep too severely." "Indeed, doctor, sleep proves elusive when the mind wrestles with puzzles. Perhaps you might spare a moment to discuss your recent patients. I find myself curious about the late Mr. Blackwood's final weeks." Dr. Whitmore rose stiffly, brushing dirt from his knees. Charles was generally healthy for a man of his age, though he'd been complaining of fatigue and occasional chest pains for perhaps 2 months before his death. Nothing particularly alarming. Middle-aged men often develop such complaints. I prescribed rest and a reduction in his work duties. Was Mrs. Blackwood concerned about her husband's health? Quite the opposite, actually. She seemed almost dismissive of his complaints. Told me privately that Charles was prone to hypochondria, always imagining ailments when he was stressed about work or finances. I found her attitude somewhat callous, to be honest. This information struck the detective as significant. A wife dismissive of her husband's health complaints might be a wife anticipating his demise, but proving such a suspicion would require considerable skill and evidence. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of young Mary from the Crown Inn, who approached with obvious nervousness. She had been sent to inform the detective that Inspector Morrison required his immediate presence. There had been new developments in the Thornfield case. Back at the inn, the detective found the inspector in animated discussion with a stranger, a well-dressed gentleman of middle years who introduced himself as Mr. Geoffrey Hartwell, a solicitor from London. His presence in Little Wickham was no coincidence. Monsieur Poirot, Inspector Morrison began, Mr. Hartwell has brought us most interesting information about our deceased Mr. Thornfield. It seems the man's name was not actually Thornfield at all. The solicitor opened his briefcase and withdrew several official documents. The deceased was actually Mr. James Morrison, no relation to the inspector, naturally. He was a private investigator I employed to conduct certain inquiries regarding Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood. The detective's eyebrows rose with interest. And what manner of inquiries required such investigation? Mr. Hartwell consulted his notes carefully. 3 months ago I was contacted by a Mr. Richard Blackwood of London, who believed his brother Charles might be in some danger. Richard had received disturbing letters from Charles, expressing concerns about his wife's behavior and possible intentions. The plot was thickening considerably. The solicitor explained that Richard Blackwood lived abroad on business but maintained correspondence with his younger brother Charles. In recent months, Charles's letters had grown increasingly troubled, mentioning his wife's strange behavior, her sudden interest in his will and insurance policies, and her apparent eagerness for him to increase his life insurance coverage. Charles became convinced that Eleanor was planning something against him, Mr. Hartwell continued. His final letter, received just 2 weeks before his death, was particularly disturbing. He wrote that Eleanor had been asking detailed questions about his daily routines, his medications, and even his plans for specific days. The private investigator had been sent to Little Wickham to observe the situation discreetly and report back. His mission was to determine whether Charles Blackwood was genuinely in danger, or simply suffering from the paranoid delusions of an unhappy marriage. Morrison's instructions were quite specific, the solicitor explained. He was to make contact with Eleanor Blackwood under an assumed identity, gain her confidence, and assess whether she posed any genuine threat to her husband. Unfortunately, he arrived 2 days after Charles's funeral. Inspector Morrison studied the documents with growing concern. So Morrison, or Thornfield, as we knew him, continued his investigation even after Charles Blackwood's death. Indeed, his final report, which I received by telegram just yesterday, indicated that he had discovered evidence of foul play in Charles's death. He planned to present this evidence to local authorities and return to London immediately. The detective found this information fascinating, but troubling. If the private investigator had discovered evidence of murder, where was this evidence now? His room at the inn had been thoroughly searched, yet nothing incriminating had been found among his belongings. Mr. Hartwell, the detective inquired, did Morrison indicate the nature of this evidence in his final communication? The solicitor shook his head regretfully. The telegram was brief and cryptic.
He mentioned something about the widow's performance and documentary proof of premeditation, but provided no details. He promised a full written report upon his return to London. This revelation transformed the entire investigation. Morrison had been murdered not as a random victim, but because he had uncovered Eleanor Blackwood's crime and posed a direct threat to her freedom. Yet she had maintained that perfect alibi, surrounded by witnesses throughout the crucial evening hours. The detective spent the remainder of the morning in deep contemplation, walking the village streets and observing the daily rhythms of Little Wickham life. The case was becoming a fascinating study in what appeared to be the perfect crime, until examined more closely by someone who understood the psychology of calculated murder. During his walk, he encountered Mrs. Hartwell again, who provided additional details about Eleanor's behavior in recent weeks. She seemed almost relieved, if you understand my meaning. Not the crushing grief one might expect, but something more like liberation. And her interest in that stranger was unseemly, regardless of whatever comfort he might have provided. The detective also learned that Eleanor had been seen at the village post office several times in recent days, though the postmaster could not recall her sending any letters. This detail struck him as potentially significant, particularly in light of Morrison's journal reference to the letter never posted. By afternoon, he had formulated a preliminary theory about how Eleanor Blackwood might have committed not one but two murders, while maintaining the appearance of complete innocence. The challenge now lay in gathering sufficient evidence to prove what his logical mind had already concluded. That evening, as rain continued to fall against the windows of the Crown Inn, the detective requested a private meeting with Inspector Morrison. The time had come to share his growing suspicions and begin the delicate process of setting a trap for a very clever killer. "Inspector," he began, "I believe we are dealing with a woman who has committed what she believes to be the perfect crime, twice over. But perfect crimes, in my experience, always contain the seeds of their own destruction. Tomorrow, we begin the process of harvesting those seeds." The detective outlined his theory. Eleanor had slowly poisoned her husband over several weeks, creating the appearance of natural decline. When Morrison arrived to investigate, she had maintained her performance long enough to learn the extent of his knowledge, then eliminated him when he became a threat. Her alibi was nearly perfect, but nearly perfect was not the same as actually perfect. "We must examine every detail of her movements that evening," he concluded. "And we must search more thoroughly for the evidence Morrison claimed to have discovered. A man of his professional training would not have made such claims without substantial proof."
Chapter 5. The Letter Never Sent. The next morning brought clearer skies and a renewed sense of purpose to the investigation. The detective had spent considerable time during the night reviewing every detail of the case, and certain patterns were beginning to emerge from what had initially seemed like disconnected facts. His first objective was to examine more thoroughly the Blackwood cottage, particularly that writing desk which had drawn Eleanor's nervous glance during their previous visit. Inspector Morrison had obtained the necessary warrant, though the detective suspected their quarry was far too intelligent to have left obvious evidence lying about. Eleanor Blackwood received them with the same careful composure as before, though the detective noted subtle signs of strain around her eyes. She had been expecting this visit, had prepared for it, yet something in her manner suggested that her confidence was not quite as complete as she wished to project. "Of course you may search anywhere you wish," she said with apparent cooperation. "I have nothing to hide and want to assist the investigation in any way possible. Poor Mr. Thornfield's death is such a tragedy, particularly coming so soon after my own loss." The detective made his way directly to the writing desk while Inspector Morrison conducted a more general examination of the cottage's main rooms. The desk's drawers had been meticulously cleaned, but the detective's years of experience had taught him that complete erasure of evidence was nearly impossible for even the most careful criminal. The leather writing surface bore the faint impressions of multiple documents, layered over time like the rings of a tree. Using a technique learned from his early days with the Belgian police, the detective carefully rubbed a soft pencil across the leather at an oblique angle, revealing the ghostly outlines of words and phrases. What emerged was fascinating. Fragments of what appeared to be a letter written in a masculine hand that matched samples from Morrison's journal. The words were incomplete but suggestive, evidence of deliberate poisoning and staged symptoms to appear natural, and most intriguingly, proof of purchase under assumed name. Eleanor watched this process with barely concealed anxiety, her fingers twisting her plain wedding ring in what had become a nervous habit. When the detective looked up from his work, she attempted to maintain her innocent expression, but the facade was beginning to crack under pressure. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said with gentle precision, "it appears that Mr. Morrison, for that was his true name, spent considerable time at this desk during his visits. Were you aware that he was writing reports about his observations in Little Wickham?" Her composure faltered for just a moment before recovering. "I know he mentioned keeping a journal of his travels. Many business people do such things, don't they? He never showed me what he was writing." Inspector Morrison had meanwhile discovered something equally intriguing in the cottage's small kitchen. Hidden behind a loose board in the pantry was a small glass vial, empty but retaining traces of a clear liquid with a distinctive bitter almond scent. Dr. Whitmore, summoned to examine the find, confirmed the detective's suspicion. "Cyanide," the doctor pronounced grimly. "A small amount, but certainly sufficient to cause death in a healthy adult. The bitter almond scent is characteristic, though not everyone can detect it." The discovery sent Eleanor into what appeared to be genuine shock, though the detective suspected this reaction was as carefully prepared as all her others. She claimed complete ignorance of the vial's presence, suggesting that someone must have hidden it there without her knowledge. "But who would do such a terrible thing?" she asked, wringing her hands in distress. "And why would they hide poison in my home? I don't understand any of this." The detective, however, was beginning to understand a great deal. The pieces of the puzzle were arranging themselves into a coherent pattern, though several crucial elements remained missing. The poison explained how Charles Blackwood might have died despite the doctor's diagnosis of natural causes. Cyanide could mimic heart failure if administered carefully. But how had Eleanor managed to poison Morrison while maintaining her alibi at the church hall? The answer to this question came from an unexpected source. Young Mary from the Crown Inn approached the cottage just as the investigation was concluding, bearing news that would illuminate the final pieces of the mystery. "Begging your pardon, sirs," she said nervously, "but I remembered something about that evening when Mr. Thornfield, or Morrison, I suppose, when he died. I mentioned he went out around 8:30 and didn't return until after 11. Inspector Morrison nodded encouragingly. "Yes, Mary. Did you recall something else about that evening?" "Well, sir, I was helping Mrs. Pemberton with the evening cleaning, and I saw him return to the inn. But here's the strange part. He wasn't alone. There was a woman with him, though I only saw her from behind as they went up the stairs together. She was wearing a dark cloak with a hood, very proper-like, but I thought it odd because she left again almost immediately." This revelation struck the detective like lightning. A woman had been with Morrison in his room that evening, someone who had taken great care to conceal her identity. The timing would have allowed Eleanor to attend the church meeting, slip away unnoticed, meet with Morrison, administer the poison, and return to establish her alibi, all within the span of an hour or so. But proving this theory would require more than speculation. The detective needed physical evidence linking Eleanor to Morrison's death, evidence that her careful planning might have overlooked. The breakthrough came when Inspector Morrison discovered something extraordinary in Eleanor's bedroom, a second lace handkerchief, identical to the one found in Morrison's possession, hidden beneath her jewelry box. When confronted with this evidence, Eleanor's careful facade finally began to crumble. "I can explain everything," she said, her voice becoming desperate for the first time. "It's not what you think. I never meant for anyone to get hurt. Charles was already dying. The doctor can confirm he had a weak heart, and Morrison was blackmailing me, threatening to destroy my reputation with lies about my marriage. The detective listened to her protestations with professional detachment, recognizing the desperate attempts of a cornered criminal to salvage an increasingly hopeless situation. But Eleanor Blackwood's carefully constructed perfect crime was finally unraveling, thread by thread. "Madame," he said quietly, "I think the time has come for you to tell us the complete truth about what happened to both your husband and Mr. Morrison. The evidence speaks loudly enough. Perhaps your confession might speak more quietly, but with greater honesty." Yet even as Eleanor began to speak, the detective sensed that her next performance would be as carefully calculated as all the others. The widow who had smiled too soon was about to discover that some secrets are too heavy to carry indefinitely, but she would not abandon her theatrical instincts without one final attempt at manipulation. The most crucial evidence, Morrison's missing letter to the authorities, remained to be found. The detective suspected it was hidden somewhere in the cottage, perhaps in a location so obvious that it had been overlooked. Tomorrow would bring the final search that would either prove Eleanor's guilt beyond doubt, or force him to reconsider his entire theory of the case. Chapter 6. The Poison in the Tea. Eleanor Blackwood's composure finally shattered completely as the weight of accumulated evidence pressed upon her. She sank into her parlor chair, her carefully maintained facade of grief and innocence crumbling like autumn leaves. Yet even in this moment of defeat, the detective observed, she was calculating her next move with the same precision that had characterized her crimes. "You don't understand," she began, her voice taking on a pleading quality that was nonetheless carefully modulated. "Charles was dying anyway. His heart was weak. Dr. Whitmore can confirm this. I simply hastened what was inevitable. It was a mercy, really." Inspector Morrison cautioned her about her statements, but Eleanor seemed beyond caring about legal niceties. Perhaps the strain of maintaining her performance had finally become unbearable, or perhaps she recognized that her situation was hopeless. The detective suspected it was a calculated decision to control the narrative of her confession. "My husband was not the kind, simple man everyone believed him to be," she continued, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief that the detective now knew was part of her theatrical arsenal. "He was suspicious, controlling, and increasingly paranoid about my every action. He accused me of trying to harm him, searched through my belongings, even threatened to change his will to leave everything to his brother Richard." The detective found this revelation particularly interesting. A wife who stood to lose her inheritance might indeed be motivated to expedite her husband's demise, but Eleanor's confession was raising as many questions as it answered. "The poison was originally intended for rats in the cellar," she explained. "Charles purchased it himself from the chemist in the next town, complaining about vermin in our storeroom. I simply repurposed it for a more pressing problem." Dr. Whitmore, who had remained to oversee the collection of evidence, confirmed that small amounts of cyanide could indeed mimic heart failure, particularly in someone with existing cardiac weakness. The symptoms Charles had exhibited, fatigue, chest pains, difficulty breathing, could easily have been interpreted as natural progression of heart disease rather than deliberate poisoning. "But Mr. Morrison," Inspector Morrison pressed, "how do you explain his death? You have a perfect alibi for that evening." Eleanor's eyes darted between the detective and the inspector, and for a moment she seemed to reconsider her confession. Then, perhaps recognizing that partial truth was more believable than complete denial, she continued her story. "Morrison was not who he pretended to be. He claimed to be a fabric salesman, but his questions were too specific, too probing. He knew things about Charles and me that a stranger couldn't know. When he showed me a letter from Charles's brother Richard, I realized he was some sort of investigator." The detective made note of this detail. Eleanor had just admitted to knowledge she had previously denied. Her carefully constructed story was beginning to reveal inconsistencies that suggested a deeper deception than she was willing to acknowledge. "He was blackmailing me," she continued, her voice rising with apparent indignation. He claimed to have evidence that Charles's death was not natural and demanded money to keep his suspicions quiet. Said he would ruin my reputation and see me hanged if I didn't pay him what he asked. This portion of her confession struck the detective as particularly fabricated. Morrison's journal contained no references to blackmail schemes, and his final telegram to the London solicitor suggested professional duty rather than personal greed. Eleanor was constructing a narrative that painted herself as a victim rather than a calculating murderess. "So you arranged to meet him that evening?" Inspector Morrison prompted. Eleanor nodded reluctantly. He insisted on discussing terms privately. "I told the ladies at the church auxiliary that I needed to step out briefly to check on my cottage, said I was worried about leaving it unattended so soon after Charles's death. They were very understanding." The detective recognized this as a crucial admission. Eleanor had just acknowledged leaving the church hall during the crucial time period, destroying the perfect alibi she had so carefully constructed. But her explanation for Morrison's death remained unconvincing. "We met at my cottage first," she continued, "but he was agitated, suspicious. He insisted on returning to his room at the inn to retrieve some papers he claimed would prove his allegations. I went with him hoping to reason with him privately. And then?" Inspector Morrison's voice was carefully neutral. "I brought him tea, a gesture of hospitality while we discussed his demands. But he collapsed suddenly, just as Charles had done. I was terrified. Here was another man dying in my presence, and I knew how it would look. So I fled back to the church hall, hoping no one would connect me to his death." The detective found this explanation deeply unsatisfying. Eleanor's story contained too many convenient coincidences and implausible details. A blackmailer would hardly accept tea from his victim, and Morrison's professional training would have made him suspicious of such obvious manipulation. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said with characteristic precision, "your account troubles me considerably. You claim Mr. Morrison collapsed suddenly after drinking tea you prepared, yet you describe this as coincidental rather than deliberate. Are you asking us to believe that two men in your presence died of natural causes within days of each other?" Eleanor's mask slipped further, revealing the calculating intelligence beneath her performance. "I understand how it appears, but I swear I only intended to silence him temporarily. Perhaps I misjudged the amount. Perhaps his constitution was weaker than I realized." This admission was far closer to the truth, the detective realized. Eleanor Blackwood was a woman who planned her actions with meticulous care. She had not stumbled into two accidental deaths. She had orchestrated them with cold precision. Inspector Morrison collected the empty vial and the duplicate handkerchief as evidence, while the detective continued his gentle but relentless questioning. Each answer Eleanor provided revealed new inconsistencies in her carefully constructed story, further proof that her confession was as much performance as her previous protestations of innocence. The detective's most pressing concern was still the location of Morrison's letter to the authorities. If the investigator had indeed prepared documentary evidence of Eleanor's guilt, that letter would provide the final proof needed to secure a conviction. Eleanor's behavior suggested she knew exactly where it was hidden. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said suddenly, "you mentioned that Mr. Morrison showed you a letter from Charles's brother. What became of that correspondence?" Eleanor's reaction was immediate and telling. Her eyes flickered toward the fireplace, where cold ashes suggested recent use despite the warm weather. "I don't know what you mean. He may have taken it with him when he left." But the detective had caught that telltale glance toward the fireplace. Moving quickly, he began examining the cold ashes, using a poker to sift through the remains. Within moments he discovered fragments of partially burned paper bearing Morrison's distinctive handwriting. "Inspector Morrison," he called, "I believe we have found the missing evidence." The fragments were badly damaged but still partially legible. Enough remained to confirm that Morrison had indeed prepared a detailed report documenting Eleanor's guilt in her husband's murder. The letter described evidence of poison purchase, witness statements about Eleanor's suspicious behavior, and even her own admissions during their conversations. Faced with this final piece of evidence, Eleanor's performance finally collapsed entirely. "Very well," she said, her voice becoming cold and matter-of-fact. "You want the truth." Charles was weak and complained constantly. Living with him was suffocating. "I decided life would be better without him." Her casual dismissal of her husband's life was chilling in its complete lack of emotion, and Morrison was a threat to my freedom. Eliminating him was simply necessary. As Eleanor was formally arrested for the murders of her husband and James Morrison, the detective reflected on the case's most striking features. Here was a woman who had planned her crimes with extraordinary attention to detail, yet had ultimately been undone by her own psychological need to perform rather than simply endure. The widow who had smiled too soon had revealed the cold heart beneath her carefully maintained facade. Her confession was complete, but even in defeat she had attempted to manipulate the narrative one final time. Chapter 7. The Train Ticket Secret. With Eleanor Blackwood's confession secured and formal charges pending, the detective found himself driven to complete the puzzle in its entirety. Experience had taught him that loose threads in a case often concealed additional secrets, and this investigation contained several elements that demanded further explanation. The most intriguing of these mysteries was the train ticket found hidden beneath Morrison's mattress, a ticket to London dated for the morning after his death. If the private investigator had planned to leave Little Wickham permanently, as the ticket suggested, why had Eleanor felt compelled to murder him? Her story of blackmail demands seemed increasingly implausible upon closer examination. Inspector Morrison arranged for a telephone call to the London solicitor, Mr. Hartwell, who provided additional information that cast Eleanor's confession in an entirely different light. According to Hartwell's records, Morrison had never been authorized to demand money from suspects or to engage in blackmail schemes of any kind. James Morrison was a man of impeccable integrity, Hartwell assured them over the crackling connection. His instructions were clear: observe, document and report. Under no circumstances would he have attempted to extort money from Mrs. Blackwood or anyone else. This revelation demolished Eleanor's claim of victimization entirely. Morrison had not been a blackmailer demanding payment for his silence. He had been a professional investigator preparing to expose her crimes to proper authorities. Eleanor had killed him not to escape blackmail but to prevent justice from taking its course. The detective's examination of Morrison's belongings revealed additional evidence of the investigator's true intentions. Hidden within the binding of his leather journal was a carefully folded duplicate of the letter fragments they had found in Eleanor's fireplace. Morrison had been thorough enough to keep copies of his most important documentation. "Esteemed Inspector," the duplicate letter began, "I write to inform you of discoveries that demand immediate police investigation. The death of Charles Blackwood was not natural, as initially diagnosed, but the result of deliberate poisoning administered by his wife, Eleanor Blackwood. I have documented evidence of her purchase of cyanide under an assumed name, testimony from witnesses regarding her suspicious behavior, and physical evidence linking her to the crime." The letter went on to describe Eleanor's method in chilling detail. She had been slowly poisoning her husband over several weeks, administering small doses of cyanide mixed with his evening medication. Charles's complaints of fatigue and chest pains were not symptoms of natural heart disease but the progressive effects of deliberate poisoning. Mrs. Blackwood demonstrated considerable cunning in her approach, Morrison had written. She ensured that her husband's symptoms appeared to worsen gradually, creating the impression of natural decline. She also made certain to express skepticism about his complaints to the local physician, establishing herself as the long-suffering wife of a hypochondriac rather than a calculating murderess. Most damning of all was Morrison's documentation of Eleanor's behavior following her husband's death. Rather than displaying genuine grief, she had immediately begun making inquiries about inheritance procedures and insurance payouts.
Her public appearances of mourning were carefully timed and staged for maximum effect. The detective shared these findings with Inspector Morrison, who expressed amazement at the depth of Eleanor's deception. "She's been lying to us from the very beginning," he said. "Not just about Morrison's death, but about everything: her marriage, her grief, even her husband's medical condition." A visit to the chemist in the neighboring town confirmed Morrison's documented evidence. The shop's records showed that a woman matching Eleanor's description had purchased rat poison 3 months prior, using the name Mrs. E. Harpwell, and paying in cash to avoid creating a traceable record. The chemist remembered the transaction because the customer had asked specific questions about the poison's effects and detection. She wanted to know how much would be needed for different-sized rats, the chemist recalled, and she asked whether the substance could be mixed with other liquids without losing its effectiveness. "At the time, I thought she was simply being thorough about her pest problem." Armed with this additional evidence, Inspector Morrison confronted Eleanor with the contradictions in her confession. Faced with overwhelming proof of her guilt, she finally abandoned her performance entirely and revealed the cold calculation that had driven her crimes. "Charles was weak," she said with startling matter-of-factness. "He complained constantly about his health, his work, his imagined financial troubles. Living with such a man was suffocating. I simply decided that life would be better without him." Her casual dismissal of her husband's life was chilling in its complete lack of emotion. This was not a woman driven to desperate acts by circumstances beyond her control, but a calculating killer who had viewed murder as a practical solution to domestic inconvenience. "And Morrison?" Inspector Morrison pressed. "Morrison was a threat to my freedom," she replied with the same cold precision. "He had discovered enough evidence to see me hanged. Eliminating him was simply necessary." The detective found Eleanor's final honesty both illuminating and deeply disturbing. Here was a woman capable of extraordinary planning and deception, yet utterly lacking in normal human empathy. Her tears, her grief, her carefully constructed persona of the devoted wife, all had been elaborate theater designed to conceal the heart of a killer. The train ticket that would have carried Morrison to safety in London became instead evidence in a case that would likely see Eleanor Blackwood face the gallows. The irony was not lost on the detective that a woman who had planned so meticulously had ultimately been undone by her own inability to resist performing her false grief for an audience. Yet one question remained: had Eleanor always been a killer by nature, or had circumstances transformed her into something monstrous? The detective suspected they would never know the answer, for Eleanor herself seemed incapable of honest self-reflection. As the case moved toward its inevitable conclusion, the detective found himself reflecting on the dangerous combination of intelligence and moral emptiness that Eleanor represented. Her crimes had been enabled not just by her own calculating nature, but by a society that expected women to be naturally nurturing and above suspicion of such systematic violence.
The widow who had smiled too soon would soon face the ultimate consequences of her actions, but the lessons of her case would endure as a warning about the most dangerous of criminals, those who hide their evil behind masks of perfect respectability. Chapter 8. The Performance Unmasked. The formal proceedings that followed Eleanor Blackwood's arrest revealed layers of deception that extended far beyond the murders themselves. As Inspector Morrison and the detective delved deeper into her background, they uncovered a pattern of calculated behavior that painted a disturbing portrait of a woman who had been planning her husband's demise for considerably longer than anyone had suspected. A telegram from London brought news that Richard Blackwood, Charles's brother, was making arrangements to return from abroad to attend the trial. His correspondence provided crucial insights into the deteriorating relationship between Charles and Eleanor in the months preceding the murder. "Charles wrote to me regularly," Richard's telegram explained, and his letters grew increasingly concerned about Eleanor's behavior. She had begun asking detailed questions about our family's financial arrangements, particularly regarding any inheritance I might leave to Charles. She also inquired about my travel schedule and when I might next visit England. This information suggested that Eleanor's planning had been far more extensive than her confession indicated. She had not simply decided to eliminate an inconvenient husband. She had carefully researched all potential obstacles to her scheme, including the possibility that Richard might grow suspicious of his brother's sudden death. The detective's examination of the Blackwood cottage's financial records, discovered hidden in a locked box beneath Eleanor's bed, revealed another shocking dimension to her crimes. Eleanor had been systematically stealing small amounts from her husband's wages for over a year, accumulating a secret fund of nearly £50, a substantial sum for a woman of her station. She was planning to disappear, Inspector Morrison concluded after reviewing the evidence. The money, the research into Charles's family connections, even her careful cultivation of a reputation for being a devoted wife, it was all preparation for starting a new life elsewhere. Dr. Whitmore's more thorough examination of Charles Blackwood's body, conducted after Eleanor's arrest, confirmed Morrison's suspicions about the poisoning method. Tissue samples revealed significant concentrations of cyanide, far exceeding any amount that could have resulted from accidental exposure to rat poison. The concentration pattern suggests repeated exposure over several weeks, Dr. Whitmore reported grimly. Mrs. Blackwood was essentially torturing her husband to death, administering doses large enough to cause suffering but small enough to avoid immediate detection. This revelation cast Eleanor's performance of the concerned wife in an even more sinister light. While publicly expressing worry about Charles's declining health, she had been privately orchestrating his slow and painful death. Her suggestions that he was a hypochondriac had not been casual dismissals, but calculated attempts to prevent proper medical investigation of his symptoms. The detective found Eleanor's methodology particularly chilling in its sophistication. She had clearly researched the effects of cyanide poisoning extensively, timing her doses to create the impression of natural cardiac decline. Her performance as the devoted wife had been so convincing that even Dr. Whitmore had initially accepted her assessment of her husband's character. Further investigation revealed that Eleanor had been corresponding with various employment agencies in London under an assumed name, seeking positions as a housekeeper or companion for elderly gentlemen. The timing of these inquiries coincided perfectly with the period when she had been slowly poisoning her husband. She was already planning her next victim, Inspector Morrison observed with disgust. Charles was apparently just the beginning of what she intended to be a profitable career in murder. The detective arranged for a thorough search of Eleanor's personal effects, which yielded one final piece of damning evidence: a small notebook containing detailed observations about various elderly men in the surrounding villages. She had been studying potential future targets, noting their living situations, financial circumstances, and apparent health conditions. Among these notes was a particularly disturbing entry about Mr. Pemberton, the elderly proprietor of the Crown Inn, widower, no children, successful business, trusting nature, potential candidate for employment as housekeeper leading to marriage and inheritance. The scope of Eleanor's criminal ambitions was breathtaking in its cold calculation. She had not simply committed 2 murders, she had been laying the groundwork for a systematic campaign of killing, designed to provide her with financial security and social advancement. When confronted with this additional evidence, Eleanor's demeanor shifted once again. Gone was any pretense of remorse or justification for her actions. In its place emerged a calculating intelligence that viewed murder as simply another tool for achieving her objectives. "You cannot prove intent regarding any future actions," she said with lawyer-like precision. "Curiosity about employment opportunities is hardly criminal. nor is maintaining correspondence with legitimate agencies. Her response revealed the full extent of her coldness. Even facing multiple murder charges, Eleanor continued to calculate and scheme, looking for loopholes and technicalities that might preserve some fragment of her carefully constructed plans. The detective realized that Eleanor Blackwood represented a particularly dangerous type of criminal, one who combined careful planning with complete moral detachment. Her ability to maintain elaborate deceptions while systematically destroying lives made her a threat that extended far beyond her immediate victims. The most chilling aspect of Eleanor's personality was her complete inability to comprehend why others viewed her actions as monstrous. When the detective asked her directly whether she understood the gravity of her crimes, she responded with genuine puzzlement. "I solved practical problems using available resources," she said, matter-of-factly. "Charles was unhappy, I was unhappy, and his death resolved both issues efficiently. Morrison threatened my security, so I eliminated the threat. These seem like reasonable responses to me." This clinical detachment from normal human emotion marked Eleanor as a true sociopath, someone incapable of experiencing empathy or genuine remorse. Her tears and grief had been pure performance, as artificial as stage makeup and just as easily removed when no longer needed. As the case moved toward trial, the detective found himself reflecting on the nature of evil itself. Eleanor's crimes were not the product of passion or desperation, but of a mind that viewed other human beings as obstacles to be eliminated or resources to be exploited. Her smile, glimpsed too soon after her husband's funeral, had indeed revealed more than inappropriate relief. It had revealed the satisfaction of a predator successfully completing her hunt. The widow who smiled too soon was about to face justice, but her case would serve as a reminder that the most dangerous criminals are often those who appear most normal on the surface. Chapter 9: The Evidence Speaks. As the trial of Eleanor Blackwood approached, the detective found himself serving as a key witness in what had become one of the most sensational criminal cases in the county's recent history. The prosecution had built a formidable case based on physical evidence, witness testimony, and Eleanor's own contradictory statements, yet the defendant continued to maintain an air of calculated confidence that suggested she believed herself capable of manipulating even the judicial system. The detective's testimony focused primarily on the methodical nature of Eleanor's crimes and the sophisticated planning that had characterized every aspect of her scheme. He described for the court how she had carefully researched poison effects, established false alibis, and systematically eliminated anyone who threatened to expose her guilt. "Members of the jury," he explained with his characteristic precision, "we are not dealing with crimes of passion or desperation, but with calculated acts performed by someone who viewed murder as a practical solution to personal inconvenience. Mrs. Blackwood did not kill her husband in a moment of rage. She tortured him to death over several weeks while maintaining the performance of a devoted wife." The physical evidence presented at trial painted a damning picture of Eleanor's guilt. The poison vial hidden in her cottage, the duplicate handkerchief found in Morrison's room, the forged letter discovered in her writing desk. Each piece of evidence demonstrated not only her culpability but her extensive preparation for these crimes. Dr. Whitmore's medical testimony proved particularly devastating to Eleanor's defense. His detailed analysis of Charles Blackwood's tissue samples revealed not only the presence of cyanide, but a pattern of exposure that could only have resulted from deliberate repeated poisoning. The concentration levels indicate that Mr. Blackwood was being systematically poisoned for approximately 6 weeks before his death. Dr. Whitmore testified, "The doses were carefully calculated to cause progressive weakness while avoiding immediate collapse that might arouse suspicion. The testimony of witnesses from the ladies' auxiliary created additional problems for Eleanor's defense. While they confirmed her presence at the church hall on the evening of Morrison's death, several recalled her unusual behavior during the meeting. Mrs. Hartwell testified that Eleanor had seemed distracted and agitated, frequently checking the time and making excuses to step outside for fresh air. She claimed to be worried about leaving her cottage unattended, Mrs. Hartwell told the court, but her manner suggested something far more urgent than simple domestic concern. Young Mary's testimony about seeing a cloaked woman accompanying Morrison to his room provided crucial evidence, linking Eleanor to the scene of the second murder. Though she had not seen the woman's face, Mary's description of the figure's height and bearing matched Eleanor perfectly. The most damaging testimony came from the chemist who had sold Eleanor the rat poison under her assumed name. His detailed recollection of her specific questions about the poison's effects and detection methods demolished any claim that her purchase had been for legitimate pest control purposes. She asked very specific questions, the chemist testified, about how much would be required for different-sized rats, how quickly it would take effect, and whether the substance could be detected in food or drink. These were not the questions of someone dealing with a simple rodent problem. Eleanor's defense attorney, a competent but overmatched local solicitor named Mr. Wickham, attempted to present her as a victim of circumstances who had been driven to desperate acts by an unhappy marriage and the threat of blackmail. However, the prosecution's evidence systematically destroyed each element of this narrative. The detective's analysis of Eleanor's financial records revealed that she had been stealing from her husband for over a year, accumulating funds for her planned escape. Her correspondence with London employment agencies under assumed names demonstrated premeditation that extended far beyond her immediate crimes. Perhaps most damaging of all was Eleanor's own notebook containing observations about potential future victims. When Mr. Wickham attempted to dismiss these notes as innocent curiosity, the prosecution presented handwriting analysis proving that Eleanor had been actively planning additional murders. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the prosecutor declared in his closing argument, "We have before us not a desperate woman driven to a single tragic act, but a calculating predator who viewed murder as a career opportunity." Eleanor Blackwood did not kill her husband in self-defense. She executed him as part of an elaborate scheme to gain financial independence through systematic elimination of inconvenient victims. Throughout the trial proceedings, Eleanor maintained her composed demeanor, occasionally dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief but never displaying genuine emotion. The detective observed her carefully, noting how she continued to perform even in the face of overwhelming evidence, as if she believed her acting ability might still save her from the consequences of her actions. The prosecution's case was so overwhelming that the defense had little choice but to rely on emotional appeals rather than factual arguments. Wickham portrayed Eleanor as a woman trapped by circumstances beyond her control, driven to desperate acts by a loveless marriage and the fear of destitution. However, the detective's testimony about Eleanor's extensive planning and her notebook of potential victims made it clear that her crimes were not desperate acts but calculated business decisions. She had viewed murder not as a last resort but as a practical tool for achieving her goals. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on both counts of murder. As the foreman announced their decision, Eleanor's mask finally slipped completely, revealing the cold fury that had driven her crimes from the beginning. "You understand nothing," she declared, her voice rising above the court's formal proceedings. "Charles was weak and pathetic, and Morrison was a meddling fool who threatened everything I had worked to achieve. I regret nothing except being caught by people too small-minded to appreciate the intelligence required for such planning." This final outburst confirmed what the detective had suspected throughout the investigation.
Eleanor Blackwood was a woman utterly devoid of normal human empathy, who viewed other people's lives as obstacles to be eliminated rather than sacred trusts to be protected. As the judge pronounced sentence of death by hanging, the detective reflected on the case's broader implications. Eleanor's crimes had been enabled not just by her own calculating nature, but by a society that expected women to be naturally nurturing and above suspicion of such systematic violence. The widow who smiled too soon would face the ultimate consequence of her actions, but her case would serve as a permanent reminder that evil often wears the most innocent of masks. Chapter 10: Justice and the Final Revelation. The conclusion of Eleanor Blackwood's trial brought a sense of closure to the village of Little Wickham, though the detective recognized that the deeper questions raised by her crimes would linger long after the immediate drama had faded. As he prepared to return to London, several final pieces of the puzzle demanded his attention, details that would complete the picture of one of the most methodically planned murder schemes he had ever encountered. A final search of the Blackwood cottage, conducted after Eleanor's conviction, revealed her most closely guarded secret, a hidden compartment behind the kitchen pantry containing additional evidence of her criminal enterprise. Here the detective discovered Eleanor's true journal, written in a cipher of her own devising, which detailed not only her crimes but her psychology with chilling clarity. The decoded entries revealed that Eleanor had been planning her husband's murder for over 2 years, beginning shortly after learning that Charles had increased his life insurance coverage at his employer's suggestion. Her initial entries described him with cold contempt, referring to him as the obstacle and temporary inconvenience rather than by name. The obstacle continues his tedious complaints about imaginary ailments, one entry read. His weakness provides excellent cover for my preparations. No one will suspect deliberate action when natural decline appears so obvious. More disturbing still were Eleanor's detailed observations about other potential victims throughout the region. She had been systematically identifying elderly men with substantial assets and no close family connections, studying their habits and vulnerabilities with the thoroughness of a military strategist planning a campaign. The detective's analysis of these records revealed that Eleanor had corresponded with at least 6 different employment agencies across England, creating false references and elaborate personal histories designed to gain access to wealthy households. Her plan had been to establish herself as an indispensable housekeeper or companion, gradually gaining her employer's trust before eliminating him and claiming inheritance rights. Patient cultivation of emotional dependence, she had written, followed by strategic timing of the target's demise when maximum financial benefit can be achieved. Legal complications minimal when proper groundwork has been established. Inspector Morrison accompanied the detective on this final investigation, and both men found themselves profoundly disturbed by the scope of Eleanor's ambitions. She had not simply committed 2 murders, she had been constructing an entire career based on systematic killing for profit. The discovery of Eleanor's cipher journal prompted a broader investigation into similar unsolved deaths throughout the region. Several cases of elderly men who had died suddenly after recently employing new housekeepers were reviewed, though the passage of time made definitive proof impossible in most instances. We may never know the full extent of her crimes, Inspector Morrison observed grimly. Eleanor Blackwood was clearly planning to become one of the most prolific killers in English criminal history. The detective's final interview with Eleanor, conducted in her cell as she awaited execution, provided the most chilling insights into her psychology. Stripped of any need to maintain her performance, she spoke with clinical detachment about her methods and motivations. "You all act as though I committed some great moral transgression," she said with remarkable composure. "But I simply recognized an opportunity and pursued it with appropriate planning. Charles was going to die eventually anyway. I merely accelerated the timeline for practical purposes." When asked about Morrison's death, Eleanor displayed similar coldness. He was an impediment to my freedom. Eliminating impediments is basic problem solving, nothing more. The detective realized that Eleanor possessed a form of intelligence that was completely divorced from normal human empathy. She could plan elaborate schemes and manipulate people with extraordinary skill, yet she was utterly incapable of recognizing other people as anything more than obstacles or resources. "Do you feel any remorse for your actions?" the detective asked directly. Eleanor considered the question with apparent seriousness before responding. "Remorse would suggest that I believe my actions were wrong. I planned carefully, executed efficiently, and achieved my immediate objectives. My only error was underestimating the investigative capabilities of a private detective." This final admission confirmed what the detective had suspected throughout the case. Eleanor Blackwood was a woman who viewed murder as simply another tool for achieving her goals, no different from lying or stealing except in its permanence. As he prepared his final report on the case, the detective reflected on the broader implications of Eleanor's crimes. Society's tendency to view women as naturally nurturing and incapable of systematic violence had provided her with perfect camouflage for her activities. Her performance as the grieving widow had been so convincing because it conformed to everyone's expectations about how women should behave. The detective's report would serve as a warning to future investigators that the most dangerous criminals are often those who appear most normal on the surface. Eleanor's ability to maintain elaborate deceptions while planning multiple murders demonstrated that evil could wear any mask, including that of devoted wife and grieving widow. Eleanor Blackwood was executed on a grey morning in December, maintaining her composure to the end. Her final words, according to the prison chaplain, were not expressions of remorse but complaints about the inefficiency of the judicial process. The detective returned to London with a sense that justice had been served, yet troubled by the knowledge that Eleanor's crimes had been prevented from expanding only by chance. Had Morrison not been sent to investigate Charles Blackwood's death, how many more victims might have fallen to her systematic approach to murder? The case of the widow who smiled too soon would become a classic example of calculated evil disguised as conventional grief. Eleanor's smile, glimpsed too early after her husband's funeral, had indeed concealed more than relief. It had revealed the satisfaction of a predator who believed herself cleverer than the law itself. In the end, her greatest crime may not have been the murders themselves, but her complete inability to recognize that other people possessed the same fundamental right to exist that she claimed for herself. The widow's smile had faded forever, but the lessons of her case would endure as a reminder that the most dangerous enemies of justice are often those who wear the most innocent of faces. The lace handkerchief, the train ticket to nowhere, and the letter that was never sent had told their silent story of calculated murder and cold ambition. Eleanor Blackwood had planned the perfect crime, but perfection, as the detective well knew, was an illusion that could never survive the patient application of logic and the persistent pursuit of truth. Thank you for joining me, Stephen, and the brilliant detective for another tale from Cozy Mysteries. Eleanor Blackwood's story serves as a chilling reminder that evil often hides behind the most conventional of masks, and that the most dangerous criminals are frequently those who appear most normal to the outside world. Until our next mystery, dear listeners, remember that the truth, no matter how well concealed, has a way of revealing itself to those with the patience and skill to uncover it.